born in Cleveland, Ohio, August the 24th, 1928. Up until the time I went into the Air Force, really, we lived in Cleveland or a suburb. I really grew up in a little town called Willoughby, which is just east of Cleveland along Lake Erie. I was a schoolboy during World War II, and all my heroes were the fighter pilots in World War II. I was a flying nut anyhow, and that's the fighter pilot is just sort of the epitome of flying. It's sort of the grand art. Flying by myself, which I do very frequently, I enjoy that immensely. Get up above the clouds, and it's you and God, and that's all there is, you know. It's great. You look down, all those puny people walking around like ants on the ground. It's a sense of freedom. You have, the total universe is yours. I can go up, down, sideways, upside down, anything I want. Regular mortals can't do that. But I was one of 9 young lieutenants that joined the 335th the summer of 1950. It was at Andrews Air Force Base the summer of 1950, and I had about maybe 30, 40 hours in an F-86, and I took off, and I lost all my hydraulic fluid. Well, hydraulic fluid, I had no hydraulic pressure, and it means I had no aileron boost. So it's like a little like steering your car without power steering, okay? And so it's very hard to do, particularly at high speeds. So you have to fly slow speeds. But my nose gear was in the half extended, half retracted position. What had happened is that the cylinder had fractured and all the hydraulic fluid had leaked out the cylinder. So it would not go down, it would not come up. So I couldn't belly in and I couldn't land. And I tried a couple times to bounce the gear down by touch and go on the main gear and then go back off, and nothing happened. So I ended up landing on the main gear into the nose slowly, swung down, skidded along the runway. My memory of that was they hustled me up to the flight surgeon's office. He looked me over and gave me a little thing of mission whiskey and said, "You're okay." That was it. Well, I ended up I went through a fence and it tore the tip tanks off, which were full of fuel, and all I could see was flames going about 75 feet in the air. I ended up sliding backwards. In 80, you wound the canopy open and closed, and I couldn't get the canopy further than about 8 or 9 inches open. I went out of that thing with a hard hat, seat back, and never slowed me down. The 86 was a very fine airplane. The P-80 was, and we flew, in training we flew A's and B's, which was the first operational jet the Air Force had. The 86 was much more refined over that airplane, yeah. Good airplane. In fact, many of my friends who ended up being career Air Force officers say that's the finest airplane they flew in their whole career. I remember getting checked out in it. It's a single-seat fighter. There's no trainer version for it. So the way you get checked out is you perform what's called a blindfold cockpit check, and they sit down, your flight leader sits you down and says, read this manual, and I'm going to test you on it. And then when you get all done, you climb in the cockpit, and he's sitting up there, and you close your eyes, or he blindfolds you, and he says, okay, hit the flap switch, hit the gear, hit this, hit that, and you have to do it all right without looking. And that's how you, and then when you pass the blindfold check, then you fire up the engine and go, and that's it. In the fall, about Thanksgiving time, the MiG-15s were shooting down B-29s and other fighters in Korea. And we did not have anything over there that could compete against the MiG. And so the 4th Fighter Group, which was equipped with and also a premier fighter group, equipped with the F-86, was sent to Korea. They sent the whole fighter group over. And this was about Thanksgiving time of 1950. And we were originally supposed to be stationed in K-23 in Pyongyang, North Korea, but the Chinese entered the war and pushed down, and as a consequence we had no place to go. When we got over there, we were stationed initially at Johnson Field outside of Tokyo. And about Christmas time, they took the more experienced pilots and sent them to K-14 Kimpo. And they flew for a week or two out of Kimpo. And the first MiG was shot down by an 86 at that time. It was as I said, it was a Japanese World War II strip. Suwon is about 20 miles south of Seoul. And it was surrounded by rice paddies. It was all by itself, and the town of Suwon, the front had been through there 3 times, and was absolutely flat. And our air base, Korean kids would be our houseboy, and ours was a young man who was 9 years old. Of course, there was no school, and he learned English very quickly, and he would go to the movies with us, and we would save food from the mess hall because it was so much better than what they gave him to eat. Our food over there in Sunday was terrible. There's still things that I can't eat. I can't eat Vienna sausage and Spam, because the Spam was the only meat that we had. Spam and cabbage were the staples. And there was all the powdered eggs, which at that time smelled very bad, and powdered mashed potatoes. And that was about it. And the cooks would do their darndest to try to disguise this stuff. But it was so bad that I used to trade mission whiskey for sea rations, the Army sea rations, because I thought that was better food. And there wasn't much to do. We occasionally went into town, but there was nothing much in town. A Korean marketplace has a distinctive smell, and I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where if you smell a certain smell, a whole picture comes to mind. And Korean markets were like that. All the roads were jammed with refugees, flooded with refugees, trying to get out of the way of the war. And there was, of course, virtually no place for them to escape. We lived in a tent. The squadron, my squadron was on one side of the field and the other squadrons were on the other side of the field. There was this one little spur where we parked and then the runway, and that was all there was. That's all there was. And there were 2 or 3 fighter groups because we had 51s and we had F-80s. There was more than just us on this little bitty field. Yeah. And all the cripples used to come into our field too because we were the most advanced field at that time. So anybody who was shot up would land there. You didn't think much about it except the engineers were trying to make the runway longer. And in the process of doing that, they had heavy equipment out on the overrun trying to get it going. And the guys would land, they were all shook up from combat, and they would forget to disarm their guns, and when they rounded out to land, they would squeeze off some rounds which would go off into these guys in the overrun. And you'd see fellows on their heavy equipment with helmets and flak jackets and so on, making sure they didn't get shot. I think mostly you were excited. I think you have to fly about 10 missions before you figure out what the heck is really going on. And you're so doggone excited, you don't even realize the guys are shooting at you or trying to kill you. Yeah. Mission board would be put up the night before, and it would tell you who you were flying with. Wouldn't tell you what you were going to do, but it would tell you how many planes were going and so forth and so on. Then at the briefing, the next morning you were briefed on what was going to happen. And if it was an all-out effort, it would be a group effort where they were putting up as many planes as they could. And you started your airplane on the clock. And the strip that we flew out of was a World War II Jap Zero strip, and it wasn't very plush. I think it was 4,800 foot long, something like that. And there were no taxiways or anything like that. So you taxied down one side of the runway, and you all lined up at the same time at the end of the runway. And then you ran the engines up, and you took off 2 every 15 seconds. And the leader made one great 360-degree turn, and everybody better be in formation. And then off you went. The mission of the 4th Fighter Group at that time, with the only 86s in Korea, was to gain air superiority and maintain air superiority so that no enemy could shoot down any Allied plane. And this was, if you'll recall, the Korean War was a United Nations war. We had all different kind of, we had British, we had Australian, we had South African, we had all kinds of fellows flying with us. Even in my squadron, we had a RAF pilot, Steve Daniels, and we had a Canadian pilot with us. We even had 2 Navy pilots with us. And the first missions I flew were about January of 1951. And that was out of K2 Taegu. And those were not air-to-air missions. We were carrying 5-inch rockets. And we were doing interdiction missions, trying to intercept the enemy behind the lines. Because we had no air base at that time. The Chinese had pushed us down so far, and we were slowly working our way back. It wasn't until later on in the spring that we got an air base, which was K-13 at Suwon, which was far enough north that we could get up to where the MiGs were. Any individual in the midst of a conflict like that, you don't understand much of what's going on. You know what's going on in your immediate vicinity, and that's it. So that it was even very difficult to keep track of where the front lines were and so forth. All you know is whether you're winning or losing. And the goal was to patrol and engage the MiGs in Mig-Alley, which is on the Yalu River, on the Korean side of the Yalu River, strip about 50 miles long. And you patrol back and forth and try to entice them or try to prevent them from coming across. Well, it was a buffer zone to try to try to intercept and protect any MiGs from coming south. The MiGs would try to get to the brunt of the war at that time was carried by F-80s, flying, bombing, and so forth, ground targets in North Korea. And if the MiGs could get to them, they would. And the 80 was no match for the MiG, so the idea was to try to prevent the MiGs from ever getting there and try to discourage them from even trying. The whole business was air superiority. How do you get and maintain air superiority? And sometimes it was touch and go because we were always outnumbered. They always outnumbered us about 3 to 1. And the Russians had two kinds of pilots. Either they were very, very good or they're not very good at all. And if you ran into a very, very good one, you had one rough afternoon. If they weren't so good, it wasn't so bad. Distinct memories were we had people with radars and radios on the islands off the coast of Korea who would monitor the MiGs and then translate what they were saying on the radio and tell us in the air. And they all spoke Russian. These were Russian units. First year of the war, they were all Russian MiG units. What's called a combat formation, which if you have more than one squadron or several flights, you'd be staggered at different altitudes. So there'd be a group at 40,000, a group underneath them at 35, and another group at 30, say. The combat formation, you spread out, each airplane is spread out to the degree that if somebody attacks the fellow next to you, you can turn into the attacker and try to shoot him down. I suspect it's like when you do a 180-degree turn, you know, you have to, it's all very orchestrated, much like a ballet to get everybody back in position when you're going the other way. Where it becomes chaotic is when you engage in the actual combat. The MiG could always fly higher than you could, so he always attacked from above. And when he did attack and you broke into the attack, then this fine formation would break up. But it never broke up into smaller than two. You always had to have a shooter and a wingman. The wingman's job is to protect the rear end of both the airplanes while the shooter's shooting. He concentrates on shooting. And in the midst of battle, I liken it to a bee swarm. Everybody is milling around all over the place. Everybody's trying to queue up and get a shot at everybody else. Because your guns are mounted on the airplane, so you can only shoot forward. So everybody's trying to queue up and shoot the other guy. They had to learn the MiG, what the MiG could do, and the MiG, for instance, could always outclimb you. He could outturn you above 20,000 feet. You could always outdive him, and you could outturn him below 20,000. So the tactics that evolved were how do you traffic on your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. That's how you win any battle. And then when it's over, it just disappeared. All of a sudden you're by yourself. We didn't always fly the same kind of mission. Sometimes we escorted the B-29s on bomb raids because the MiGs were devastating the B-29s. And I recall one mission very distinctly where I was assigned to go up in the morning and check the weather for the target area, which was the Pyongyang marshalling yards. And I was cruising around the Pyongyang marshalling yards about 15, 20,000 feet with impunity. Nobody was shooting at me at all. And then that afternoon I came back as part of the mission escorting the B-29s. And there was so much flak you could walk on this stuff. It was all shooting all over the place. Quite interesting. And some of it was kind of amusing. One time we were going up in formation up towards Mig-Alley. It took about, you could only patrol for about 20 minutes, then you had to come back. It was 200 miles up there from our air base. And we were cruising up there, and all of a sudden I heard this harp music. And oh my God, I've gone hypoxic, meaning my oxygen, I'm not getting oxygen. So I checked all my oxygen, and I still heard the harp music. And it turns out that the commies were jamming our radio frequency with harp music. Well, other kinds of missions, only 3 kinds that we really flew. We didn't fly any ground support missions. That was done with 86s later on in the war when they had more 86s. We did fly cover for things like Ranger operations, where they'd go in and try to destroy something and then evacuate again, or some sort of landing. And I can recall very distinctly, we were up there before sunrise, and when somebody shoots at you at night, every round looks like it's coming straight at you. I was with a very fine pilot, and we were at what's called bingo fuel. That means we're getting low on fuel and you got to go home. And we had about 10 MiGs cornered between us and going home, i.e. they had us cornered. And grand pilot, he says, are you scared too? I said, sure I am. He said, so am I. And we busted right through those 10 MiGs and went on home, never got a scratch. Breaking into an attack, and we got into, and you turned back and you got into what's called a scissors. And at one point I started to do a barrel roll to try to get around behind the guy. And I was about a quarter of the way through the barrel roll, and he realized what I was doing, so he started to roll with me. And our canopies were close enough that I could look up and see this black helmet and eyes, and all I could think of was, you son of a gun, you're just as scared as I am. You only think about that kind of thing after you've been through a scrap, and you come back and you sit on your bunk and take a swig of mission whiskey and think about what you've just been through. we lived in a tent, and a flight would live in a tent. All the pilots from one flight, and of course, there's no way to tell a North Korean from a South Korean. So the North Koreans knew exactly where the pilots were barracked, and they would send over what we call Bed Check Charlie, which is a little biplane, and he would come over in the middle of the night and bomb the dickens out of us. And the worst bombing we had, I recall waking up to the bombs going off, and I looked up and I said, "That's strange. I can see the stars through the tent." It perforated the tent with a bunch of holes, and I picked a big piece of flak, which I somehow have lost, but I kept for years because it had Russian writing on it, out of a 2x4 that went right over my nose and broke a 2x4, embedded in a 2x4. And went outside. We had slit trenches by the tents and stuff. And I went outside, and bombs had hit one of our 86s, and it was burning on fire. And the most heroic thing that I think I saw the whole war was a sergeant jumping up in front of the guns, trying to disarm the guns until they ordered them away, because what would happen is the fire gets to the guns and it would cook off the rounds and fire the guns. And yeah, but that put a couple guys out of commission and devastated several airplanes. Now this was not high tech. This was a little biplane that would fly down the valleys underneath the radar, and then pull up, and the guy in the back seat would throw out these anti-personnel bombs. I have a very sterling memory of a Marine Corsair coming over on a bright moonlight night just after we'd been bombed, looking for Bed Check Charlie, and he got right over the field, and the Army mistook him for the enemy and started shooting at him with one of the anti-aircraft, and when one opened up, all the rest opened up too. And this guy was shot full of holes and crashed onto the runway, and he was sure one mad Marine, I'll tell you. Now, I've got to tell you about my crew chief. When you're flying your plane, your life depends on the guy that maintains it on the ground, and he's called a crew chief. So he's a very important guy. And my crew chief was a reserve recall. His name was Gus Miller, and he liked scotch. So I made sure every time I went back to Japan that I brought him back some scotch. But he would do things like you wouldn't believe. I would come back and I'd say, I think the main fuel regulator's outside. Shh, don't say anything. And the next morning I'd say, "How's the plane?" "Right on, Lieutenant, you're ready to go." And about 3 planes down, you'd hear the crew chief say, "Somebody's main fuel regulator's out." He'd swiped it during the night. If you're with a gang of fellows or a gang of people, and your life every day depends on a mutual support, you become very deeply bonded with that group. And I don't know anything else that does that way. And we used to, our old fighter group, just the pilots used to get together, but now most of those guys are gone. And that was a happening. That was a lot of fun. And we lost guys over there. We lost some operational, some in combat. That's always bad. There aren't many of that 9 young lieutenants. Today, there are only 3 of us left. Now, they weren't all lost in the Korean War. Several of them were. Larry Layton was shot down in my airplane a few weeks after I left Korea. Another kid spun in out of an overcast. And you'd say, that shouldn't have happened. And then we lost guys. A couple guys were lost in Vietnam. One guy was lost in an F-100 crash there. Just, and there are 3 of us left. I pray to God they never have to fight a war. Wars are terrible. There were 2 million Korean citizens died in the Korean War. I don't think many people know that. In the current war, there's 25,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed. It's terrible. Wars are terrible. And I don't think the news or anybody else ever publicizes the impact that it has on the people. It's terrible. Korea was just flattened, just absolutely flattened. My wife and I went back in about '79 to Seoul and Suwon, and I just couldn't believe it. All these skyscrapers and so forth. What I remembered, everything was flat. It had been mowed down by the war. That's a toughie. Wisdom. I'm very proud of my Air Force service. I'm very proud of it, and I'm very proud of our Air Force. I would love one of my grandkids to be a professional pilot in the Air Force. Whether they will or won't, of course, up to them.